we should use the term Kemet rather than the term Egypt, because that is the name that the Kemetic people used to refer to themselves. The name Egypt was used by Greek people and is therefore a foreign name, not a native African or a native Egyptian name.
Listervelt Middleton, one of the leading educational television producers on African history.
Why is ancient Kemet so important to the world and to black people, African people in particular?
Ancient Kemet is important because it's humankind's oldest civilization. It's the development of the best effort of a group of people to organize themselves. And for Africa, that's especially important since African people have been so defamed, even to the extent that some have said that African people had no civilization. In fact, African people developed the first civilization, which was Kemet. It is as important to African people as Greece is to European people.
What did these Africans develop in the way of science?
Well, of course, in the development of civilization, we would refer to Kemet as a high technical civilization. The sciences, as we know them, were well advanced in Kemet, thousands of years before they had that kind of development before. The art of writing, astronomy, music, any area that we now consider to be an important academic area already had its beginning in Kemet, and it was very well developed.
Now, you know, a lot of African Americans watching this will say now, what do the descendants of African slaves in the United States have to do with these ancient Africans in Kemet or Egypt?
Well, it's important for any group of people to have a sense of, or to have the ability to answer three questions about themselves. And these questions are Booker T. Washington Coleman, a Washington, D.C. historian's questions that he uses in organizing his educational experiences for children. He says every human being ought to be able to answer the question, who am I? Where in the world am I? How in the world did I get here? Now, most well-developed nations spend millions, maybe billions of dollars answering those questions for themselves. That's why you have Smithsonian Institution for the United States. That's why you have libraries. That's why you have universities that invest in history departments and so forth. African people have almost forgotten, because we haven't had the resources to take care of that part of our existence. It is the knowledge of one's history that gives a strong sense of belonging and identity, which provides the basis for group unity, which provides the basis for political and economic power.
What is the connection, the genetic connection, the cultural connection between the Africans who are now in the United States and those of ancient Kemet or Egypt?
Well, it's fairly clear that the pattern of movement of people on the African continent, and it moves from...
we'll go to the map.
It moves from beginnings here in the Nile Valley beginnings,
okay,
where the Nile River actually starts right here, and it will go down here, joined by another Nile, the blue Nile coming from Ethiopia, the white Nile coming from here, joining here and coming this way. So the migration pattern of human beings was down this river into Egypt, and then there were migration patterns over into West Africa many times, and some of the time the migration actually went from Egypt into across the top of the Sahara and into these parts. And we believe there are people here now who are quite similar, and probably, as was said in the book by Felix Du Bois, Timbuktu the Mysterious, they're probably both the cultural and the genetic descendants of the people of Egypt, and they're the Dogon people here in Mali.
Let me ask you to go over that again, just to make sure that
right,
that we get all of it.
Okay, early man begins here in this area somewhere.
And we're talking about the cultural
We're
connection, the genetic connection.
We're talking about the people first, the genetic connection, and then of course they carry their culture down the river. These were black people here. They carried their culture down the river before they went out and populated the rest of the earth. Then, of course, they migrated not only north, but they also migrated from here out into parts of West Africa, into the south. They then also migrated from Egypt, which is here, or Kemet, as we should call it, across the Sahara into areas of West Africa. Mali would be a case in point.
Okay. Now, some African-American parents will say, our children are maiming each other. Our children are on drugs. And here you are talking about ancient African history. Why is this relevant? How do you respond to that?
It's one of the major pieces. It's not the only piece. You can't say that if someone takes a course in chematology that they will stop drugs tomorrow. But you can say that if a group of people has no sense of being a part of the historical world, that is, if we see ourselves as mere spectators, that we just sat on the sidelines as the march of humanity went by, that has an effect on how you live your life. And one way we know this is that we watch what happens when children and adults learn this information about African people. The difference in attitude, the difference in self-esteem, self-concept, self-image, you can almost see those things change before your very eyes.
What are you seeing? What have you seen?
Well, I get letters from young men in prison who, upon reading some of the works of great African historians and seeing some of the illustrations that we have to offer, who are abruptly shocked, changed, and almost put on a new mission. They almost take up a new purpose. And I have many letters like this, as well as people who are well-educated, maybe even people in universities and colleges who have spent 20 and 30 years in their discipline. But when they learn this information, they talk about having a transformation experience. And they are very explicit about how these things affect them. So, you know, we have abundant examples of how this works, and it would be really wonderful to figure out a way to be able to show that.
Okay. Now, master keys to the interpretation of data on Kemet. What is this concept of master keys, and how did you arrive at it?
Okay, the idea of a master key is simply that in the face of the fact that there is so much information on ancient Kemet, so much information on Africa for that matter, and it comes to us in bits and pieces, like little episodes. In order to give a sense of order and coherence to it, it's necessary to identify certain key concepts, key principles, guiding ideas that will organize all of this information so that it makes some sense to the person who is trying to comprehend it. It's a study tool, a guide for the analysis of information, right.
Okay. Let's take a look at the first graphic.
Kemetic culture was pre-dynastic. Let me go to the timeline for this because it's...
Okay. Let us wait a minute for the time, okay.
Okay, here we have a time chart that shows this line here, which is a line that starts way before 3000 BC, and it comes to a period of time after Christ. And this is the line of culture showing that the way of life of the ancient Kemites remained the same for over 3,000 years. This, of course, is their political control. Now, these are the 4 golden ages of ancient Kemet. But this is the dynastic period that begins here, after which we have these 4 golden ages. When we say pre-dynasty, we mean before Dynasty 1, things were going on back here that are not well documented.
Dynasty 1,
before Dynasty 1, which was before the founding of Kemet as a nation.
In the year?
And this would go back as many years we don't know. Some people say another 5,000 years. Some say another 20,000 years. In fact, the Kemetic historian Mir N. Jehudi, or Manito, suggested that you could go back to 25,000 years at the time that Kemet was ruled by the gods, and then finally by these wise people, and then finally it was organized as one nation in Dynasty 1. So, for example, we know that not 3000 BC, but at 4236, or some people say 4241 BC, the calendar that we use now was already in operation in the Nile Valley. 42,036 or 4241 BC. That calendar was already in place. That is an incredible thing to realize the technology, the mathematics, the number of years of observation that it would take to create that calendar. And that shows that the culture is older than the nation, in other words. So Kemetic culture is pre-dynastic. So the main point of this master key is that we should look in Africa for a long period of development, and we should not begin our analysis with the beginning of the nation of Kemet. We should look for what went before it.
Okay.
Okay, the New York Times had an interesting article which was about the oldest nation in the world, and this is an example of what I was just talking about.
Back to the chart.
Here is Kemet, 3100 BC, beginning. But in the New York Times, they tell us there was another nation that is somewhere around 3500 BC, at least 200, maybe 300 or 400 years older than Kemet. There's this nation called Taseti, and this nation is further up south on the river in an area called Nubia, and that is called the oldest monarchy in the world. And of course, they excavated the graves of these kings in Nubia, and these kings in Nubia were said to be tall, black-skinned people. The goddess Isis and her child were already in place at the beginning of Kemet.
Which was, you said?
Which was
Already
3100 BC,
Dynastic,
and then that's dynastic Kemet. So dynastic Kemet begins after the religion that was the primary religion of Kemet had already been created. So when you go to Taseti, for example, there is God Horus. This child that's being held by the Virgin Mother is already recorded in Taseti, south of Kemet, and it's much older than Kemet. So the religion is in place, astronomy is in place, writing, the hieroglyphics or Medu Neter is in place. All of those things are already in place. So the culture is in place before the political organization of Kemet as a nation.
Okay.
Osiris is the god who was associated with Isis, the husband of Isis, symbolically. You see Osiris here with the shepherd's crook and the flail, and he was then the supreme god who was married to Isis. So that becomes the god who is married to a virgin, and they have an offspring, and so we have the first holy family. And so that's an example of a religious story that is similar to the Christian story, but it's 3,000 years older than the Christian story.
And is there a resurrection element here also?
Osiris was resurrected. He was crucified by his brother, cut up into 14 or 28 pieces, depending on the story. His evil brother Set, jealous of him for several things, cut him up, and he was, again, he was risen from the dead to rule over the dead. and that was the story
And
of Osiris.
This is
the
how many
earliest
years
story of the resurrection.
before the Christian?
Again, that goes back about 3,000 years before Christ.
Okay. Master key number 2.
Okay, the second concept that we need to keep in mind, Kemetic culture remained intact through the 7th century A.D. The culture, that's this cultural line that I showed you on the chart. And if we can go back to the chart here.
Okay, let's hold it a minute. Let's let our people get in place.
Okay.
Okay.
So here's the 3,000-year line. It stays the same, the way of life, this religion, this philosophy, up to this point right here. And it's at this point that we get a rather abrupt change in the culture of Kemet. The reason for it is that the conversion of Africans in Kemet to the religion of Islam. This is after the Prophet Muhammad, and then you get at this point a change in belief, but you also get a change in population at this point. You get large numbers of Arabic-speaking people, people with Arabic culture, that come into the Nile Valley and join those that were already there and give to what is now Egypt, rather than Kemet, its essential character, which we see still present in Egypt today.
Okay, let's go on.
Okay, on the third master key, generally in Kemet, if you look at the data, the older things are, the better they are. In other words, the first cultures were more perfect than later cultures. So if I go to this time chart here, and I get back to Dynasty 1, come to Dynasty 3 when they started building pyramids, the earliest pyramids are the best pyramids, and they're still standing.
Okay, let's see if we have an example.
The last pyramid, here's an example of the early pyramid, the step pyramid. That's the first pyramid. That pyramid is still standing. It was not the most perfect pyramid. The most perfect pyramid would be the Great Pyramid. And the Great Pyramid is that one in the far part of the slide, and that is the Pyramid of Giza. But we see 2 other pyramids with it. Now, these are some of the best formed pyramids. These pyramids would be around 2500 BC. After this, there were about another 75 or so pyramids, and they began to deteriorate in quality. So that's one example of older being better.
While we have this graphic up there, the pyramid, how tall is that?
That pyramid, the Great Pyramid, is about 43 stories tall.
Built when?
Built, the Great Pyramid was built around 25, or a little longer than 2500 BC.
Okay.
If we look again at older is better, if we look at the text, this is the text of the oldest Bible in the world, written on the walls of the tomb of Unas. And if you read what becomes from this and other tombs, a book called the Book of the Dead. Its formal name is the Asar and Heru, or the Book of Coming Forth from Darkness into Light. Then you'll see that, for example, you see no pornography there. You see, in fact, you don't even see pictures there. You see pure text. And if you go back, the text was pure, not only in written form, but in symbolic form. It was better looking text. It looked better as it was carved into the walls and colored, and some of those colors are still there.
Okay.
And in addition to looking better, the ideas were less contaminated with superstition and what have you.
Okay.
We see, for example, older is better here again in terms of the temple at Saqqara. This is the funerary temple at Saqqara of King Zoser that was done approximately 2700 BC. And we see here also the antecedents of Greek architecture. If you see the columns here, these columns dating now from 2700 BC, compared to the Parthenon on the Acropolis, which would not appear until around 500 BC. So here we have something more than 2,000 years older than that building that we call the Parthenon in Greece, and it's already present in the architecture.
So when we see
Kemet.
Columns, we're seeing African.
We're seeing African columns. They're copies of African architecture.
Okay.
The fourth master key is that you always have to remember when looking at any information from Kemet that their orientation was up south.
Are you going to be using the map for this?
We can show you
Okay,
on the map
let our folks get in place. Okay, go ahead.
that that this river starts here and goes this way, which means it flows from south to north, so it's going downhill when we go this way. That means it's going uphill to go this way. The ancient Kemites always looked back this way, up river, as the source of their home, their inspiration, and so forth. For example, for them, the word south and face were the same. The word left and east are the same. The word right and west are the same. So their general orientation was to the south with their back to the North Pole. And that was what they used as their main point of orientation. We must keep that in mind.
Okay.
This would be an example of the Nile River, for example, which is very interesting in Kemet. One of the beauties of this river is that they have winds that blow from the north going south, so that if you want to go north, you just float. If you want to go south, you get help from the wind.
Okay.
And so that was helpful, because if you floated one way, you wanted to be able to get back.
Okay.
Okay, the fifth principle or master key, fifth concept, organizing concept, is that the origin of the people and the culture, like the orientation, is also up south. So we look, in order to show this, for a cultural unity between the Kemetic people and the Sudanese people, for example. Now, that great Egyptologist, E. Wallace Budge, used to say that he felt that he understood the Kemetic writing better, and at least the Kemetic religion was understood better by him when he studied the religion of Sudanese people. The further south he went and watched the religion that was being practiced at that time, the better he understood the ancient Kemetic religion. So in other words, you didn't go to Saudi Arabia or to Europe and study those religions to try to understand Kemetic religion, because they were not like the Kemetic religion. The cultural unity was between Kemet and the people up south. The sixth organizing principle is that generally significant leaders are southern. And I'm going to go to the time chart on this again. Those who founded, just watch this, for example, those who founded, the king who founded Dynasty 1 was a southern king, Mina. The kings...
When you say southern, you're talking about...
That means he came from up south. That means he would come from the area today that we call somewhere near Luxor, even some cases as far south as Aswan, sometimes even outside the country. But what I'm saying is that each of the founding dynasty plus the dynasties of the four golden ages, which are the Old Kingdom or the Pyramid Age, the Middle Kingdom or the Literary Age, the New Kingdom or the Temple and Imperial Age, the Late Kingdom or the Revival Age, each of these four golden ages was initiated from the south. In other words, their kings, their family, the royal family at that time came from the south. That's a very important fact.
Who were clearly black and
because
African.
they were then black and they are now black, even in 1990. The Luxor population is a black population, and definitely when you get to Aswan, that's a black population.
Okay.
Okay, the Imperial Age was centered at Waset. The Restoration Age was centered at Waset. And Meroe, which is even further south than Waset, it's even out of the country. Meroe is all the way up almost to Sudan or Khartoum.
I like that name, Waset. I wonder, what does that mean?
It means the scepter. Why do you like the name Waset?
There's something about it. I don't know what. It means the scepter. Now you got to tell us what that means.
Waset, of course, today is called Luxor. And before that, the Greeks called it Thebes, but the Africans called it Waset. And Waset meant the scepter, the symbol of authority and rulership and power.
Okay.
The literary age was started at Waset. the priesthood at Waset was that was the home base of the preachers. You know,
And why is that significant?
It's very important because you had this peculiar kind of thing where what Plato was striving for in his Republic, the idea of philosopher king, was a reality in Kemet. That the priests were the ones that disciplined royalty. In other words, the pharaoh, contrary to what many people believe, did not have a free reign. That he had to gain, in effect, the approval of the high priest of the time. And so this high priesthood had as its center base Waset, and from there subsidiary lodges would be found all over the country, especially from the 11th dynasty onward.
Okay.
Prior to that time, of course, they had several major centers.
Okay.
Okay, this is one of our first pharaohs, early pharaohs, and of course this is the pyramid pharaoh, Zoser, who built the step pyramid and whose funerary complex we looked at before that had those so-called Greek columns. We can see clearly here this is an African man.
Okay.
If we skip from Zoser to this pharaoh, we have skipped from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom, and this is the pharaoh who founded the Middle Kingdom, the Second Golden Age, and it was from Waset that this family lived and ruled, and that was Dynasty 11, Mentuhotep II. He's a very important pharaoh, but several other important pharaohs also lived in this same city of Waset, and they also were critical not only to Kemet, but also to other parts of the world, such as this one. This is Pharaoh Senwosret I, who is known in history, according to Martin Bernal, who wrote the book Black Athena. This is the pharaoh who is the legendary Greek figure. He's a Kemetic figure, but the Greeks referred to him as Kekrops. His name in Kemetic is Keperkare Senwosret I. And he is the one that Bernal credits with the founding of the Greek city-state of Athens. So that there is this external relationship between Kemet and the rest of the world as far back as 2000 BC. This is in the Middle Kingdom. Okay, here we have in that same kingdom a pharaoh who is also known to the Greeks, according to Martin Bernal's work and others. His name is Amenemhet III. And Amenemhet III is that legendary character who fought with Agamemnon in the Trojan War. In the Greek-Trojan War, we had Ethiopian troops, and Greeks call Kemetic people and other Africans black people, and the word for that in Greek was Ethiopian. So this is the figure. Here he is again, Amenemhet III. And Amenemhet III is the legendary Memnon of the Greeks.
Okay.
Nefertari is the queen mother of the Third Golden Age. She was married to Pharaoh Ahmes, or she's sometimes referred to as Ahmose Nefertari. You can see that she's clearly black, but she's also a part of that Waset family, this up-south family, showing again the southern origin of leadership. And so here you have this key dynasty, the 18th, which is sometimes called the Grand Golden Age, the biggest of all the four Golden Ages, the age of imperial expansion, the age of architectural expansion, and so forth. So she would be one of the major figures illustrating this point about the up-south nature of the leadership. Okay, here we have Pharaoh Amenhotep III with his wife, Queen T. This is the mother and father of Pharaoh Akhenaten, who was married to Nefertiti. Most of the people who know Kemet, they know about Nefertiti, but they should really know about Nefertiti's in-laws, because they were really important people, especially the wife. The wife is Queen T, and Queen T is the woman who literally ruled Kemet along with her husband, co-regent with her husband. There are letters from Asian kings in cuneiform, where when they got into some difficulty, this is the woman they asked for help. They didn't write to her husband, they wrote to her, so that you could say that she was a co-regent with her husband, and therefore became very important.
And this is the mother of?
That's the mother of Pharaoh Akhenaten, and some people also say the mother of King Tut, and the mother-in-law of Nefertiti.
Okay.
Again, these are Waset families. These are up-south families. Here's another up-south priestess, Anut Tawi, who is a priestess of ancient Kemet, but again, she's up south. So if you notice that the center of power at this time is in the middle of the country, or in the part of the country least infiltrated by outside influences, less mixed racially, less mixed culturally. And that would be examples of what we've been talking about.
People are so used to seeing white Egyptians.
Right.
One must ask, where do these people come from?
Right. Well, see, those people have been there all the time. They're just not in the books. The books that show pictures of white Egyptians normally show pictures of the Egyptians, not the Kemites, and that means they're showing pictures of people who were ruling or who were in Egypt during the Greek and Roman times and after that. And so it's always important to date the picture and to know whether you're talking about royalty or not.
Okay.
There's virtually all creativities are indigenous, and the invasions are destructive. The Greco-Romans were imitative. So if I go back to the chart here, and let's take a look. Golden Age number 1, Golden Age number 2, invasion. This is the first invasion. This was a destructive invasion from Asia. They are not given the credit with building temples, with building pyramids, with building religion. They were very destructive. And then there is a return in Dynasty 18 and 19, which is the third Golden Age, and the Greco-Romans don't actually get to Kemet and begin to impose their name, Greece, and their culture and their political control until here. You see, the Greeks come in 332 BC, which is after all 4 Golden Ages, but they didn't destroy. They're the exception to the invasion being destructive. What they did was imitate. Now, the Romans that come in after the Greeks, beginning about 30 years before Christ, they're the ones that began to destroy again. And particularly, they destroyed the educational and religious institutions to the extent that they were able to do that over the course of 200 to 300 years.
Now, at that 332 BC, is that basically when you see the white?
Right. This is when you'll see large numbers of white. Well, you also see it here with the Persians in 525 BC. But then you're talking about large numbers of settlers here with the Greeks, Alexander the Great, and then the Caesars here with the Romans, and you had large numbers of people infiltrating into Alexandria and around Cairo. Generally, they didn't go very far up south, but nevertheless, some did. And it's not until you get the Arabic population that you begin to get that large infusion of foreigners up south. Okay, this is part of the literature during the period of the, in fact, this dates all the way back to the beginning of Kemetic times.
But that this was in place.
This would be in place, and it's part of the culture all the way through, and it's an example of what people destroyed. You know, the invaders were destructive rather than creative. They didn't create this religion, it was already in place.
The Egyptian Book of the Dead deals with what?
The Egyptian Book of the Dead is really much like the first 5 books of Moses or the Pentateuch in the Old Testament. It deals with the creation. It deals with, some people say they're spells, you know, but you have to really get into the study of Kemetic religion to understand that these things are part of a very deep symbolic studies that you don't just talk about. You have to go through a training process in order to understand them.
Okay.
This is an example of the Immaculate Conception of with the god Horus, god Osiris lying down on his back, and you'll see the goddess Isis, who is hovering above him with his erect penis, and that is the actual Immaculate Conception in stone, and this is at the Temple of Abydos, and that's a story, of course, that we'll pick up in Christianity, and that was already created by Africans long before it appeared in anybody else's religion. Here's an example of the imitation. You know, all of these are examples of imitation. The Book of the Dead was imitated in the religious literature of other people. The creation story was imitated. Here's the imitation with a God giving life to now a Greek pharaoh. This Greek pharaoh is this is outside the temple of Horus at Edfu, which is a reconstructed temple under the authority of the Greeks with their money. When they took over, they followed the desires of the priests, and they began to reconstruct. That's imitation. This is after Alexander the Great. And this is Alexander the Great here, or at least one of the statues of Alexander the Great. And you can see how different this is.
Who goes into Egypt?
He goes into Egypt and is in fact welcomed by the Kemetic people of the time as the deliverer from the Persians. They were happy to see him come. And generally speaking, you could say the Greeks were fairly respectful of the Kemetic people, but they were basically imitators of the Kemetic people.
So when the Greeks went in there, the Africans were already out of control.
Yes, they had already lost control to the Persians, and they never regained control again after that.
Okay, master key number 8.
Master key number 8 is that if you want to understand the thinking of Kemet, you must think in terms of symbolic thought and metaphorical thought. If you take things literally, you'll be mistaken. So that if you think that just because you see a God that has a man's body and an animal's head, for example, that this is animal worship, you will be missing the entire point, because there's much more to it than that. And so here we have examples of the use of things like, well, look at Khepera there, for example, the beetle. You know, comes from a study of biology. So they noticed that this beetle, the dung beetle, a particular beetle, would bury its eggs and then would bury them in the sand, and then as the sun came out, it would heat, and then all of a sudden these eggs would break open. And so they associated that with birth and creativity and creation. And so the Khepera then becomes the God who is coming forth. So you show the beetle, but you don't mean beetle, so you're not worshiping a beetle. You're using the beetle as the symbol of the idea of creation. Okay. This is another example. Here's a man with a dog's head. You're not worshiping the animal, the dog, but that dog, the jackal, according to Schwaller de Lubitz and others who studied this, is the symbol he is used as a symbol associated with the preparation of the dead, in this case, embalming. His name is Anpu, or some people, the Greeks call him Anubis. That dog is the symbol, is used as a symbol because he can dig up dead meat and eat it before it putrefies and is of no value, so that he makes fine distinctions. He can discriminate between what is life-giving and which is life-taking. And so they say, well, why not use him as a symbol for judgment, for making fine judgment? So you see him here, but you will also see him at handling the scales of justice, where the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of truth. So that is a symbolic thought, not to be taken literally. But most people who try to study Kemetic religion tend to try to take it literally, and they will make a mistake every time.
So aren't Christians sometimes referred to as sheep and the shepherd?
Sheep and the shepherd, right, in Christianity. And you don't expect that people are actually calling people animals, right, but they're manifesting sheep-like qualities, you know, and the shepherd is acting in relationship to people the way the shepherd acts in relationship to sheep. Okay. Okay, the last, not the last, but the 9th master key. Science generated religion, philosophy, and general culture. In other words, it's really important in looking at ancient Kemet to know that the basis of the culture was totally scientific. In other words, painful observations, tireless observations over literally thousands of years produce insights into how nature works. And it's nature's pattern that reflects a divine will, according to the Kemites. And so when they expressed religion, what they were trying to do was to capture the essence of what they had understood through revelation from scientific study. And so it's extremely important to realize that it was through the work of science that people became spiritual. We have it almost backwards in Western culture from this particular point of view. In other words, we receive, in many cases, religion without having to do anything for it. We don't have to study anything other than catechism, so to speak. But with the exception of a very few religions, few seem to have an idea that study of the natural world is, in fact, also associated with study of the spiritual world, and that one depends upon the other, or both depend upon each other, if you would put it that way. Okay. So that's a very important point.
Okay, Master Key number 10.
Number 10 is that the Kemetic people, I mention this because so often you hear interpretations of Kemetic religion as being a polytheistic religion, and without getting it, meaning the belief in many gods as opposed to the belief in one great God. And again, you can believe whatever you want to believe, but just to be historically accurate, the Kemites were always monotheistic, never polytheistic. And because people don't understand Master Key number 9, symbolic thought, they misinterpret this principle. And they see with all of these different gods, instead of seeing different aspects of one God, they see different gods. And to the ancient Kemites, they were people who tended to think holistically, and there was always a great hidden God who had many powers or manifestations. There was no difference between, for example, in thinking in holistic terms, between science and religion. They were all the same. You couldn't separate science from religion. Between the sacred and the secular, all life was sacred. So there's no secular, you know, we'll behave ourselves on Sunday and let the rest of the week take care of itself. No caste system, no church-state separation, no school, science, and religion separation. You know, the idea of the separation of church and state would have been unthinkable to the Kemite. So that they thought holistically, and at the center of that holism was a spiritual base, because their whole purpose of the society was to seek the divine.
Okay.
Okay. Another master key or principle is to be aware of chronological order, especially the golden ages, and compare the golden ages to the period. Let me go to this chart here, because we've talked about this before.
Okay, wait a minute.
If we look at this is chronological order: 3000, 2000, 1000, birth of Christ, 1000 after Christ, and 2000 after Christ. Well, if we look at the golden ages of Kemet, first golden age, and compare it to the period, you know, we look at the pictures of the pharaohs who were here, and we compare it to the absence of data here. For example, there's very little data about this intermediate period. Although it wasn't a foreign invasion, it was an internal upheaval. This is a period of disorder, so you have very little to point to. You don't have great pyramids of this time, for example. 7th through the 10th. Great temples, the 7th through the 10th dynasty. But when you go to the 11th and 12th dynasty, suddenly you have this explosion of literature and culture again. Then you get this invasion, and that's where you don't have any. Try to go to a museum and get something from the 13th, 14th, or 15th dynasty. You can't find it. Then ask yourself, in the dynasties where you have the data, who were the pharaohs and the queens? That's what I've been showing you. Same thing here. Suddenly the 18th and 19th dynasty are the grand dynasties. Ramesses II, Nefertiti, Tutmosis, all of those. Look at who's ruling, and then here's the period. You know, this is the second intermediate period of an invasion. This is another period, the period being the gap between the golden ages. And you could also call this a period, too, a kind of a late period, which is after the 25th dynasty, which was a native black African-led dynasty. And this is the period, and then you know that that if you look for the people here, you'll see Alexander, you'll see Persians, and you'll see so-and-so. But the high-tech, high-developed periods are always the native periods. And so it's very important to keep the chronological order. Otherwise, you will have people who will confuse what was happening in Greece with what was happening during the Pyramid Age. And you'll have people saying that Africans got help building the pyramid. And there was nobody, no major group of people, no large group of people, even in Africa at the time of the pyramid, other than African people. That's why you have to have the chronological order straight.
This is the remainder of number...
Okay, and the rest of that, note that the Greco-Roman period comes at the end of Kemet. Cultural Kemet is still in operation. In other words, during the time of the Greeks, the Kemetic people were still operating their culture. The Greeks didn't change that. Although the Greek culture changed. Greek culture changed because they came to Africa and copied African people. Also note that this period, being the most recent, is the source of most of the material in museums. So this will confuse you. If you go to museums, you'll see many busts of Greek people dressed up like Africans, Roman people dressed up like Africans. They're mummifying their bodies. They're burying their bodies in these caskets that are copied on the style of the Greeks. They have their pictures inscribed on the wall. And so there's so much of this material from 300 BC and so little of the material that survives from 2700 BC that unless you're careful, you would think that the Greek period was the typical period. It is not the typical period, it's the exceptional period.
Okay, let us go on.
Right, so this then sums it up as the dynastic chart. Then we can see where the Greeks and Romans fall in this, and you can see that they fall clearly toward literally after all the developmental periods are over. There is literally no Kemetic cultural development after the 25th dynasty. Okay. After that, it's all imitation or destruction.
Okay, master key number 12.
Master key number 12 is that in order to get a real picture of who the people were, you need to get as many pictures of a king, queen, as possible. More than one picture. Like with Nefertiti, we only usually see one picture. We see two pictures of her, you will see that the one picture has to be in error. Okay. So that you always get as many pictures as possible so that you can sit them side by side, and that will give you an answer to the question of whether these were black or white people. Okay. So if you look here, this would be a picture of Amenhotep II, the second, the grandfather of King Tutankhamun. The next slide will show Amenhotep the third, the father of Akhenaten and King Tut. And so if you show this as a family sequence, then you begin to get a sense of what the racial makeup is. This would be Amenhotep III and his wife Tea, which we showed before. The next would be their son, Akhenaten. So you can see if we put them together now, then the son looks like the parents. If you see this picture of Akhenaten by himself, many people can't explain him except as a departure from the norm, as they've said. So if we look at the next slide, we'll see...
because they're looking at pictures that are outside the family.
Right, because they're looking at pictures outside the family. So they say he looks abnormal for a white person. Right. And that's true. But he wasn't a white person.
Right. Master key number 13. Okay,
the last master key is that Egyptology, and notice I refer to myself as a chematologist. So I'm a student of ancient Kemet. Egyptology takes the name that the Greeks used, Egypt, for the name of the academic discipline. So that must mean they're studying the period after the natives, apart from the natives. They really don't think that they are, but I'm very insistent on this terminology. Egyptology, which comes largely after Napoleon, is mainly the product of European scholars that emerged during the slavery and colonization period. That point cannot be overemphasized. The meaning of that. For example, if Africans are precluded from doing the research, from digging up, evaluating, publishing, disseminating information, and if the people who have ulterior motives, designs on the African continent, are the ones who are writing the history of the African continent, doing the research on the African continent. You have bias almost on its face. But we don't even have to look at bias on its face. We can look at Martin Bernal's excellent work in Black Athena, and we can look at, in particular, at the chapter that he does on the racism in the science of Egyptology, to show that the Egyptology work was influenced by the fact that these nations that were doing Egyptology were stealing bodies and stealing lands from African people. So we can never forget that the academic discipline is colored by its time.
Okay.
Now, there are 11 ways. I've been saying, I've been emphasizing, and that's part of the purpose of this whole program, is to reclaim for Africa and for African people the Kemetic civilization. And there are 11 ways that one of our great scholars has shown that you can answer the question that people have, how do we know, that these were really native black African people? So I call this 11 categories of converging evidence showing that ancient Kemet was native black African. This is very important because you can't just say that they were black. You have to know what is the evidence for it. And so that's our purpose now. And it falls into these 11 categories. Now I'll run through them briefly. Evidence from physical anthropology. This is Cheikh Anta Diop's first point, that if you measure the skulls from graveyards before the nation of Kemet, and that population didn't change after Kemet got started, that the skulls in terms of their length, width, face, nasal length, cephalic index, and so forth, that what you find is that those were black people. In other words, that's, some people would argue that they were a mixed group, but then you would have to, if you use that criteria, those criteria, then you would have to say that most African Americans are not black people. But in other words, because there will be a range of skull shapes, a range, maybe if you could see the skin color, which you can't, there would be a range of skin color, changes in facial angle and things like that. So there would not be what they call the true Negro, whatever that's supposed to be. Right. But Cheikh Anta Diop went through that evidence quite well, and it's reported in his article, The Origin of the Ancient Egyptians, and that's a very important article for people to get. It's found in the book Great African Thinkers in the Journal of African Civilization. The second point is that if you look at the Kemetic images, and that's what I've been showing, the painting of Nefertari, the painting of the carving of Amenhotep, the carving of Amenemhet, the carving of Zoser, pre-dynastic and early dynastic, when you look at the natives, if they're clear, according to Cheikh Anta Diop, they are always black. And I think I showed that by picking the golden ages and sticking with them. Okay. The third way that we know is that you can actually find mummies and test the mummies for the amount of melanin content in the skin of the mummy. And Cheikh Anta Diop created the melanin test, did that test, and found that the mummies that he was able to test were in fact black people. And here's an example of Tutmosis I. Here's the example of...
There's another one.
Yes, here's the example. This is Tutmosis IV. He's even darker than Tutmosis I. These mummies are black-skinned, and some people have argued that, well, they're only black-skinned because of the way they embalm them. But that's why Professor Cheikh Anta Diop was able to create a dosage test for melanin, because the melanin molecules remain firm over a long period of time. And he did that and showed that the mummies were indeed black, the ones that he tested. And if he had been able to test the others, we feel certain that the same thing would have been true.
Okay.
Then this is bone evidence. There is a rule by one of the old Egyptologists and paleontologists that said that the typical Kemetic type was short arm and negrito, if you look at all the skeletal remains. Then the fifth...
we'll go to the next. I think we
can go to the next. This would be a slide of the... from the tomb of Ramesses III, showing the two black figures in there, one is Kemetic and the other is Nubian, showing that there's no difference between the Kemite and the Nubian, but the other two are Asian and kind of European, and there is a pictured difference in that tomb between the Asians and Europeans, but not between the Egyptians and the Nubians. Okay, the fifth way that we know is that you can still check blood type in the skins of mummies. And so what you're looking for, if they were black, you're looking for blood type B. If they were white, you would be looking for blood type A. That work, to the extent that has been done, according to Cheikh Anta Diop, shows that the Egyptians, even today, are mostly B. And that there's no point where we ever had a predominant or even a significant A population in Kemet, as far as any evidence. Then after the blood group, the next category of proof has to do with the testimony of classical and Greek and Roman authors. So here's just a list of some of the people who saw the Kemites with their own eyes. Herodotus saw them in the 5th century BC. Aristotle saw them in the 4th century BC. Lucian saw them in the 2nd century BC. Strabo in the 1st, and Diodorus in the 1st century AD. All of them referred to the ancient Kemites as black people. So it would be not until, according to Bernal again, in his study of why some scholars seem to be saying something different. He said they changed the story at Göttingen University beginning around 1750 when Göttingen was founded. And you had a group of professors there who apparently wanted to rationalize German nationalism so that they began to deny what the old Greeks and Romans had said, who were eyewitnesses, by the way, and these professors were not.
Okay.
Then the Kemetic people called themselves black people. And Cheikh Anta Diop, again, has gone through the proof of that through the analysis of certain Medu Neter hieroglyphic designations. In particular, the name Kemet, K-M-T, not just K-M. K-M is black, but when you add the T to it as a determinative, and when you add the key to it, Kemetu, and when you add the determinative, little man and little woman with 3 strokes under them, that's the plural. So that's man and woman plural. That means people. And Kemetu means the black people, not the black land. And that argument has been made in Cairo, by the way, at the symposium sponsored by UNESCO, where everybody was invited to talk about the color of the ancient Egyptian, or the race of the ancient Egyptian. Divine epithets, or names given to good gods and black gods, as Cheikh Anta Diop has shown, is that the good gods are always shown as black gods. The evil gods are always shown as red gods in different colors. So people generally tend to associate the color of their divinity with themselves. So that would be another piece of evidence. Any one of these by itself is not enough. But if you take them all collectively, then we have something that's very important. Divine epithets. So beneficial gods are shown as black ones. Hippopotamus Set is red, and so forth. Okay, the next piece of evidence would be from the Bible. Biblical evidence says that Kemetic people were black people because, according to the interpretation, Ham is the father of the black race, and Shem is the father of the mixed race, and Japhet is the father of the white race. And Ham's children then would be the black children, and that would be Cush, which is Ethiopia, Phut, which is Somaliland, Mizraim, which is Kemet, and Canaan, which is present-day Palestine. So all of those were black lands, according to your reading of the Bible. So that would be another piece of evidence. So number 10, then, is that the culture that I showed you was 3,000 years long of Kemet is very close to the culture of the rest of Africa, not to Europe, not to Asia, but to the rest of Africa. For example, circumcision was present all up and down the Nile Valley even before 4000 BC. Then number 11, there's a linguistic unity. This is another aspect of culture. the language of ancient Kemet is closely tied to the language of the rest of Africa, especially to the languages in West Africa. And Cheikh Diop was able to show that kinship between this and his own language. More recently, Greenberg's classification of language talks now not about a Hamitic language anymore, but a Afro-Asiatic language, and the only non-African language in the Afro-Asiatic family is the Arabic language. But all the other languages, Chadic, for example, Kemetic and Cushitic, that's Ethiopian, Egyptian, Chad, Libyan, those languages all fit together as a family of languages, and they are basically all anchored on the African continent. So to say Afro-Asiatic is really kind of misleading because there's not much Asia in any of those groupings. So the unity of language also shows the unity of culture and suggests the unity of people.
Okay, now you've talked quite a bit about this chart. You referred to it quite a bit.
Right.
But I want you to go through this chart and give the chart its own special place. Okay.
You want the chart to have a special place in the program.
That's right.
That's because your people work so hard to create this.
That's right. Okay.
Okay, this is a summary then of the Kemetic timeline related to other important African events. Once again, cultural Kemet, over 3,000 years. Political Kemet is a shorter period of time. In other words, the nation gets organized here, and they go through some troubles, but basically natives control during these 4 golden ages. Breakdown period, a foreign invasion. Abraham is given a date, according to biblical scholars, is somewhere around 1750, just so people who know their Bible will know where that falls. And it's suggested that he may have come in with this invading group. And Moses is around 1300 BC, somewhere around there. No one is certain, and one of these pharaohs in here is supposed to be the pharaoh of the Exodus, so that will give some sense of chronology with respect to biblical events.
But when Abraham came on the scene,
right,
what had these Africans already achieved?
Well, you had 2 golden ages already finished. The Pyramid Age was finished, and the Literary Age was already finished by then. The Bible was in place, the pyramids were in place, astronomy was in place, language was in place, writing was in place, etc.
The Africans there, they already
well
believed in resurrection.
Already believed in one God, and they already believed in resurrection. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. The Persians then come in here, and this is the death blow to ancient Kemet's governance, not to its culture. See, the culture still lasts. That's this line here. Here's the Persians, and they didn't change the way of life. The Greeks come in, they didn't change the way of life. The Romans came in and tried to change it, but didn't change it substantially, even though they destroyed temples and schools and churches. The way of life didn't really get changed until their conversion to Islam down here. So that we will, now, let's take a look at this. European slavery doesn't really start until 1500 AD. And so here's all of this ancient African history back here that's left mostly out of our children and our adults' education as well. Arab slavery needs to be put on the board too, because in East Africa there was a very vicious and brutal Arab slavery in East Africa. And then European colonialism begins in 1884 and is still going on as far as Southern Africa is concerned. So we see these events in relationship to the ancient Kemet. One more thing, which has to do with the University of Sankore, that it was in different territories, in the same territory called by different names, Ghana, Songhai, and Mali. But the city of Timbuktu becomes very important as one of several major university cities in West Africa. And I just wanted to make sure that we knew roughly where Sankore was. It begins somewhere around 1200 and goes all the way up till after 1600. That's the end of Sankore. And this is important because it was a great university in the ancient world, and many of its faculty were taken to Morocco, and they had this university, by the way, when many European nations didn't have much in the way of universities at all.
These Africans already knew that a mine was a terrible thing to waste.
Yeah.
Back then.
I wonder if they made any money.
Now, obviously, the reason that you research all of this is not just so that African people can feel good about ourselves. What is the ultimate objective?
Well, the ultimate objective is to force a truthful rendition of the human experience. That, in other words, we must know what the truth is about humanity so that we can know what the truth is about ourselves, so that we can be not just feeling good about ourselves, but that we can become whole people. And you can't be a part of the human family unless you are a creative part of the human family, and therefore you must claim your own creativity. Don't claim any more than you created, but you must claim your own creativity.
Is there some value to the process of studying ancient African history?
It's a very liberating process. The process of studying ancient African history is one that will take you into many waters. For example, it will take you into the waters of the defamation of African people. You will begin to see the calculated way that some people have tried to destroy African memory and African culture. And it's very important for us to understand that these things have not happened by accident. It's important so that we will recognize when defamation occurs, that it is occurring, and that we will understand the motivations of those who do that, and that we will know who the people are who do those things and how they do it. And that's the only way that we can defend ourselves against these kinds of things.
Do you think we understand how much effort has been put forth to keep this information about ancient Egypt and Nile Valley civilization out of the hands and minds of African people? Do you think we understand?
No, I don't think we have any idea of the mechanisms or the intensity of the effort, how long it's been going on, and the fact that it's still going on. In other words, for example, most of the pictures that I've shown in this slide presentation so far are pictures that most people have never seen before. Not because they weren't there, but the decision was made to use other pictures. The decision to use Nefertiti rather than T is a decision that you have to evaluate in terms of its meaning for Egyptian history or Kemetic history. For example, Queen T was more important than Nefertiti. But Nefertiti stands as the symbol of the typical Kemite. And that has to do with the, I think, the ulterior motives of people who do the research.
Now, how has the writing of history by European writers, historians, helped to promote what some have called the Europeanization of human consciousness?
Well, if the total source of your information is from a group of scholars that comes from one culture, they're imprisoned in their own culture, and most of them even don't have the capacity to stand outside the culture and to view it critically in the first place, and some don't even have the intent to do that. So there's nothing that they can present other than a focus that comes from their own center, which we call European-centered. And if I, as a person who studies, do so uncritically, or if I don't participate in the production of scholarship, raising the kinds of questions and priorities that I need to know about as an African person, a person of African descent, from an African-centered perspective, then there's nothing left for me but a European-centered information base, which will produce in my head a European way of viewing the world, even though I'm a person of African descent.
Let's break it down. How does European consciousness manifest itself in our lives? A couple of examples.
It manifests itself in self-hatred, where African people actually accept the doctrine of white supremacy and believe that white people are superior to black people, so much so that they reject their own historical memories, they reject identification with their brothers and sisters, they reject identification with Africa, they reject identification with African culture, You know, this is literally cultural suicide. And the reason is that it's so painful sometimes to be associated with the kinds of images that are projected about African people, the false images.
When I wrote this question down, I had no idea your answer would be that great.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know it was that great.
Do you think we realize the extent to which we are controlled by European thinking?
No. You see, the control that we experience is so subtle. It seems natural if a professor has a PhD, is in a prestigious university, and teaches the classics, and I'm a student at that university, and I take this course in the classic. He must know what he's talking about. He has a PhD. This is a great university. It's been here for a long time. So it's natural to go through Homer and never ask the question, what is an Ethiopian? Why did the Greeks call him that? Why did Homer spend so much time studying and talking about Africa? Why was the relationship between Africans and Greeks so good? You see, if I'm not critical, then those kind of thoughts will never occur to me, and that's a very subtle kind of process. We are not aware of that process at all, mainly by virtue of the kind of socialization process that most of us have gone through.
You have said that this is all about a battle for the mind. What do you mean by that?
Of course it is. The question of whether we have the independence to raise our own questions and to project our own priorities. You know, there's a song that many of us remember. Papa may have, blues song, right? Mm-hmm. Mama may have, but God bless the child that's got his own. So the blues singer understood better than many of our academics that it was essential not to be dependent. Garvey used to say, any people that accepts the ideas of another people automatically will become the slave of that people.
To what do you attribute this need on the part of Europeans, maybe more specifically European scholars, others within the European collective, to put down, belittle the African history?
Well, that's one of the universal rules of oppression. Any group of people that wants to control another group of people must destroy the historical consciousness of that group of people. Dr. John Clark is famous for saying, it is impossible to continue to oppress a consciously historical people. And so oppressors know that. And one of their main military tactics is historical, is a historical attack. The erasure, the suppression of history is a military tactic. It's the chief way of disabling a population. And so that is well understood.
What do we mean by African consciousness, and what does it mean in terms of a value system, briefly?
Well, of course, African consciousness would grow out of an intimate knowledge, familiarity with study of the cultural experience of African people. And what comes from that is a point of view. It's unavoidable. If I spend time studying the poetry of my people, the music of my people, the philosophy of my people, the religion of my people, the science and contributions of my people, doesn't mean I have to reject anybody else's science and contributions and so forth, but what it does do for me is it gives me a firm base in my own creativity, and that unavoidably will produce in me an African consciousness. And that's very important. Now, African consciousness is the ethnicity of African people. And there are characteristic values, and I think those are summed up in many ways in some of the work that has been done on the Nguzo Saba, you know, and the seven principles. Sometimes we see associated with Kwanzaa. We're a collective people, for example. We take care of each other. I mean, there are typical cultural traits that people have identified with African people for long periods of time. They grow out of our southern cradle environment in the African continent. We welcome the stranger. For example, Cheikh Diop in his book, The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, identified some of these parameters. The fear of the stranger is typical of the northern cradle. The love of the stranger is typical of the southern cradle. The northern cradle being the European, the southern cradle being the African. The Africans always welcome strangers. You know, you could go to Africa, leave your bag, come back 2 years later. If you left books there, they present you with your books when you came back. You know, that is actually an example that comes from the book, The Strong Brown God, by de Grammont, who talks about this explorer, Clapperton, and that actually happened to him, where he had left some things and came back 2 years later, and his things were presented to him. That's how welcome he was made to feel. So there are many values. I can't go into all of them, but
this business of a people using the study of history to reclaim its mind, its consciousness. How unique an undertaking is that, and how do we know it will work?
Well, it's not unique at all. In fact, you name me a successful group nationally, and I will name you a group that's invested heavily in the reclamation of its history. One example of that would be German people, who the Grimm brothers, for example, are said to have collected fairy tales in order to reconstruct the ancient history of German people so that they would have a basis for identifying themselves ethnically as a people to mobilize nationally. That happened with the Jewish people and the reclamation of their history and the development of the State of Israel. It's happened with the Japanese people in recent times and so forth. There is no group of people who ever become strong and powerful without an investment in its history.
You have mentioned the positive things that will flow from a study of African history. But are there some negative things that can flow from it?
There are some negative things that can flow. For example, if we allow ourselves to glorify at the expense of truth, you know, in other words, we're so hungry for an appropriate positive identity that we begin to give false meaning or false interpretation to the facts of our experience. So, for example, that we would skip over the negatives in our experience. And see, everything isn't positive about Africa. Some things are positive, some things are negative.
Say that again.
Everything isn't positive about Africa. Nothing is positive totally about any group of people. We have our pluses and we have our minuses like all other people. If I'm blinded by the search for glorification so that I can't honestly appraise what my true experience has been, I will be misguided in the use of history, even though it may feel good. And so that's one of the dangers that, for example, a lot of people talk a lot about we were kings and queens. Yes, we were kings and queens, but we were also ordinary people. We were common folk, and that was just as good as being kings and queens. And we need, if we are going to give value to the experience, to give value to the total experience.
And if you have to feel as though you are a descendant of a king or queen, maybe something is wrong. I mean,
something is wrong. If that's the only way that you can be ego strong, there's something wrong with that. Right? Yeah.
This history, which shows the greatness of African people, frightens some African people.
Right.
How do you deal with that?
Well,
and why do you think that is?
People who are oppressed, you know, they have something called the Stockholm Syndrome that talks about how hostages react after they come out of captivity. That many of the hostages act almost as if they don't want to come out of captivity. And when asked how they were treated as hostages, they start talking about how well they were treated as hostages. In fact, it's called the Stockholm Syndrome because one of the Stockholm hostages married one of their captors. You know, so there was that close an identification and intimacy between those who oppressed and those who were oppressed. So that is very typical oppressed behavior, to lose track of one's moorings and to glom on, so to speak.
So that example says what about the African American experience and the relationship?
That many of us may have become too comfortable with a dependency relationship, and that independence is frightening. You know, that taking on the responsibility associated with making your own choice, that you not only make your choice, but you have to live with the choice that you make. It's sometimes much easier to have someone else take care of you. So
what have you found to be the best way of sharing this information with people who are just now coming into this information?
Well, I only know one way to go, and that's straight ahead. And I found that it's straight ahead. It doesn't hurt anyone. You know, I don't mince words. I don't hold anything back. I talk to the children just like I talk to the adults. And I found that people are amazingly strong and able to pick up the conversation if it's presented to them. I don't think you have to sugarcoat it.
But there are preachers, as you know, there are preachers, let's just mention preachers for a second, who know that the Africans, many Africans, believed in the resurrection.
Right.
But at the same time, and they know but many times they don't want to let their members know this.
Yeah.
How do you?
Yeah. Well, see, you have to ask the question how much they know. See, they may know the conclusion, but they may not feel comfortable with the information that supports the conclusion. So when they start telling this story to the congregation, they get lost, not being able to support the kind of thing. See, I've worked with a lot of preachers who have taken this information and have begun to educate their congregation. I mean, this is one of the most remarkable things that I've seen in the last 10 years, is the openness of both congregations. For example, I was in Florida, and there's one minister there, Reverend Carter, who had sat on the front row himself and had his congregation go through a 2-day workshop on this ancient African history and other things, and told them if they didn't come, they were sinners.
All right. By the way, some of my best friends are ministers.
Oh, I thought you were going to say sinners.
No. We got less than 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay.
What are some of the things, briefly, that we need to watch out for where the study of Egyptian Kemetic history is concerned?
Well, you
quickly, right now and in the years ahead.
You know, one of the main things is that as people begin to jump on the bandwagon, so to speak, we need to watch out for those who would use this thrust for their own personal ends rather than as a search for truth. Because you find a lot of people who find they can make money, you know, doing things with respect to Egyptian history. And I don't have any problem with people making money, but if we betray the essence of the thrust by making materialism the reason for doing the study of ancient Kemet, that's the thing probably that worries me more than anything else.
Okay. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Always.